I feel like CLA is a really good check against the instructor who falls in love with the sound of their own voice. Hey everyone, this is going to be like kind of a low quality video about the games that we do at Beacon Jiu Jitsu and why we do the games, why I really believe in them, and why I think it's kind of our secret weapon versus maybe other schools in our area. I'm going to plan to send this to all new students, as they start their training a couple classes in, it'll just go out to them. But if you're kind of stumbling on this video because you're interested in ecological jiu-jitsu or the CLA approach, then I hope that you get something from it. So, first one I want to start is just laying out like what is it and why do we do it. So CLA, which is what I tend to call it, it stands for the constraints-led approach. If you Google online, you'll find other stuff where for ecological jiu-jitsu or task-based learning, it's all essentially the same thing. People call it different things. And this is really sort of a field of study that emerged in like colleges and universities when they were studying exercise science, and they were really starting to conduct tests with different groups of students and seeing, okay, what is the best, like most efficient way that people learn? And you can go down a rabbit hole and find all this really cool research about that. But I just want to mention that beginning just to reassure you that this isn't something that me or the coaches at Beacon came up with. This is not bro science. This is like fairly well vetted, which is one thing that really attracted me to it. If you ask 10 people what CLA is, you're going to get 10 variations of the same answer because the explanation gets like really thick and academic. So I'll just give you my kind of simplified answer, how I look at it, which is the constraints-led approach, or CLA. It's based on the theory that the best way to learn a game is by playing the game. And if you can't play the entire game because it's too complex, then what you need to do is you need to play chunks of the game while trying as best you can to recreate the environment of the game so that you can learn more efficiently. A good example that almost everyone can relate to is you go to your friend's house and they break out a board game and there's a group of you. And there's always that one guy that he stands up and he's, over explaining how to play the game. And, he explains the rules, but then he starts getting into like strategy and all these like hypothetical situations. And inevitably, there's always that one person that kind of cuts them off and says, hey, how about we just start playing? Let's just start playing the game. I'm sure we'll figure it out as we go. And that person is almost always right, which is, once you start playing it, there's this initial period of confusion, but like very quickly, you all kind of self-organize and you figure out how the game is supposed to be ran, and you start having fun sooner, which is sort of an underappreciated aspect of it. CLA is a very similar thing in jiu-jitsu, which is that the best way to learn jiu-jitsu is by doing jiu-jitsu. So the purest expression of jiu-jitsu is doing full contact sparring, right? So the best way to learn jiu-jitsu is by just doing full contact sparring all the time, right? Well, of course not, right? And the reason is because jiu-jitsu is too complicated, where if you just are thrown in with the instruction of, submit your opponent and don't get submitted, it's too vague, and a new student, they are just going to get beat repeatedly, they're going to get demoralized, and I'm sure over a long enough period of time, they would start kind of self-teaching themselves and they would acquire some skills, but that's definitely not the best way to do it, right? So what CLA says is, okay, let's take certain chunks of jiu-jitsu, like how to escape from someone pinning you in mount, how to get past someone's legs, guard passing, and then let's isolate those things and let's create a task for someone training where they have a really simple, understandable goal that doesn't require them to know anything about jiu-jitsu, which is, hey, you're going to get on top of someone, you're going to sit on them past their hips, and you're going to try to hold their wrists down on the mat and keep them there as long as possible. And then the person on the bottom has a similar kind of simplistic goal. And then what you're doing is they're working on a skill that they will often use in jiu-jitsu, but you're stripping out the complexity and you're putting these really clear constraints on them so that it doesn't devolve into full-on sparring. Because otherwise, if you just sit people down and you say, okay, we're just going to start and mount, right? And the person on the bottom, you just have to escape, and the person on the top, you have to try to submit them and stay on top of them. That's better than doing full-on sparring, but it's still too complex. There's too many things that could happen, and they're not going to be able to focus on getting better at one individual task at a time. So CLA is a way to sort of focus your training, but still give you the most important part of BJJ, which is a resisting opponent, right? If you train too much without any resistance, then what happens is you have good, like, sort of theoretical knowledge about how a technique should work, but your ability to practically apply it goes down, right? Why have we embraced CLA at Beacon Jiu Jitsu? I'm going to give you 3 reasons. The first is like long and the other 2 are pretty short. So the first reason is that I feel like CLA is a really good check against the instructor who falls in love with the sound of their own voice. For people that have been training for a while, you know this instructor really well. This is the guy that they spend 10 minutes over explaining something that they probably could explain in 3 minutes, a technique or some sort. And then what they do is they break you out and they let you start trying it. And then the same instructor who like over explained everything, they're kind of hovering around the mat and they're interrupting all the groups. And as soon as they see a student showing any hint of confusion, they jump on them, man, and they're grabbing their hands and being like, no, you need to put it here. And, you know, they're just doing that. They're popping from group to group and they're just like heavily interfering with their own training. And then half the time that instructor stops the whole class and they're like, stop, hang on, you guys don't get it. You know, I see a lot of people doing this. And then they spend 5 more minutes explaining the technique. And then they break you up and they do the same thing again. And at the end of the day, you know, that's 20 minutes that the class spent, and that the actual students got very few reps doing the thing. And then what that happens with that instructor, I believe, is it kind of reinforces a narrative in their mind of like, man, these students don't get it. And I actually have to go slower. I have to double down on explaining stuff because, you know, I spent 10 minutes explaining something and they couldn't figure it out, right? I hate that instructor. And I'll be honest, when I first started teaching, I've done that. I've been guilty of that. A lot of us have, right? When we first start, there's this mindset of like, man, if I don't explain everything, how are they ever going to figure out jiu-jitsu? And I believe what that does is it creates a student that is not self-reliant. You know, sometimes the secret of teaching is getting out of your own way and just let the students do it. Right? Let them break up into groups. And part of that is you got to let them do it wrong, right? You got to let them do it wrong 2, 3 times and then just wait. Just don't jump in there right away and see if they sort of self-correct over time. And I believe in order to do that, you fundamentally have to believe that people are smart. People are mostly smart. They can mostly figure out stuff on their own if you just get out of their way, right? And of course, if a student is completely lost, then yeah, you jump in and you say, hey, let me show you one little thing that's going to make a big difference. But then after that, you get back out of the picture and like let them work the problem. And when you do that, what you're doing is you're encouraging a self-reliant student. A student that at the first sign of trouble, their first instinct is not to stop and to raise their hand and call you over and be like, I don't get it. I tried it one time. It didn't work. What am I doing wrong? At Beacon, we want students that, you know, when they're not experiencing success, they say, okay, well, let me workshop this. Let's try it again. Let's try it again. Let me try putting my leg this way. Let me try grabbing on the left side instead, right? And then what happens is you build that self-reliant student that is willing to sort of stick with the problem and figure it out, right? So that's the first reason. Like, we want to build self-reliant students instead of making instructors the gatekeepers to all knowledge. Second reason is really simple, which is I really think that CLA is more fun, right? I think the classes have a higher level of energy. I think the experienced students, the blue belts, they really appreciate it because they spend less time hearing a lecture of stuff they might already know. And then they can, you know, help pass on the teaching when they're actually doing the games themselves. And I just feel like it makes for like better vibes. People get more tired during class and it's just a better workout. And that leads into the third reason, which is I like CLA because at Beacon, you know, we don't have a full schedule yet. You know, we're running 4 classes a week. We're going to start running more. Classes are an hour long. We encourage people to stay later. But when you think about it, that's not a lot of time to be training jiu-jitsu. And CLA maximizes the amount of time that you spend on the mats working against a resisting opponent. Instead of just saying, hey, we're going to spend the last 10 or 15 minutes sparring, and then you get 15 minutes working against a resisting opponent, I want in an hour-long class, I want you to get like 45 minutes of working against a resisting opponent, including the sparring at the end, right? I think that is like the most efficient use of time, is you got to be in there playing the game against a real opponent that is trying to stop you. That's how I think you're going to maximize your learning. So that's why we are really into CLA at Beacon, and why I want to keep exploring it and keep doing more of it. And I hope the students enjoy it. And now you know what the reason is why I take the games like so seriously, and I really, think deeply about how I'm going to create the right environment for students to not just learn, but also to teach and to kind of teach themselves over time. I hope this was helpful. Thanks a lot.